Welcome all. My name is Jen Rowe. I'm from the city of Boston and as chair of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization's TIP Process Engagement and Readiness Committee. I will call this meeting to order and read through some of our introductory notices and guidelines. So go on to the next slide, please. All right, you are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully, or if you have any technical difficulties, you can contact Adriana Jacobson, MPO staff, at ajacobsen@ctps.org, or at the phone number 857-702-3663 or via the chat box in Zoom. And all participants will join this meeting with muted microphones. We do ask that you rename yourself, include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After the roll call, board members will be able to mute and unmute themselves, although we ask folks to stay muted unless you're actively speaking. And then to participate in the discussion, please use the raise hand function, either using the participants button at the bottom of the screen. A window will pop up with the raise hand button at the bottom, or using the reactions button in the toolbar. As chair, I'll then call on participants. And if you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. Great. So for anyone who's just joined, my name is Jen Rowe. I chair this committee and also represent Mayor Michelle Wu in the city of Boston. I'll now call upon other members of the committee, beginning with MassDOT Seat 1, Office of Transportation Planning.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Clem from MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning, Seat 1.
Chris, MassDOT Seat 2, Highway Division, or Project Management. All right, we will loop back at the end to see if anyone joined later on. Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Good afternoon, Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
Thanks, Eric. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, RTAC here.
Thanks, Len. Town of Brookline.
Good afternoon, Erin Chute, Town of Brookline here.
Thanks, Erin. Town of Arlington. All right, we'll loop back. And then I am noticing that there's a note about an AI assistant. I don't know if we allow that in the meetings, so I'll ask kind of MPO staff to identify if that's allowable or not. Is that just coming to me, or is that coming to everyone?
I'm also seeing that on the co-host side. I believe we've had this before in meetings, but I may need to defer to others on staff if there's any issue there. I don't think we've encountered it, or I don't think we've encountered an issue with it before in prior meetings. It's not unusual.
We'll move on to Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
Rawson from the city of Somerville, representing Mayor Valentine, Inner Core Committee, and I'll note that Tom Bent is here as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti, Metro West. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good. Dennis. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Kristen Keyshard, representing the Magic Subregion.
Thank you, Kristen. And then Metro West Regional Transit Authority.
This is Tyler Tarasi, representing Administrator Jim Nee for the Metro West Regional Transit Authority, present.
Thanks, Tyler. And then has anyone joined from who I did not call upon, or I called upon and who has joined afterwards. I think it was MassDOT and Town of Arlington.
I do not see John from Arlington or any folks from Highway HQ.
Okay.
I just saw someone in from MassDOT, so I'm not sure.
I think that might be Melissa from District 6. But yeah.
Okay. I do believe we have quorum, so we'll continue on. And because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion today, I won't have everyone else introduce themselves verbally, but I would welcome any non-members to share their name and affiliations they have in the chat. There are two topics on the agenda. On both items, MPO staff are looking for our direction. The first, they've outlined a couple options for rescoring projects to put us in a better position this year to make decisions about projects scored under different sets of criteria. And on the second, they're looking for us to indicate our preference among 4 initial scenarios for bringing the 5 years of the TIP into fiscal constraint. Before I turn it over to Ethan to lead us through, we do have an opportunity for members of the public to comment. We traditionally offer this at the outset of the meetings. That being said, we do allow and welcome non-members to contribute to discussion throughout. So there's no pressure to comment now if you're able to stay on. So all that being said, is there anyone from the public who'd like to take the opportunity to speak? And I see Pam.
Hi, I'm Pam Helnick. I'm the Assistant Director of Planning and Community Development for the town of Hudson. And I just want to speak really briefly in support of Hudson's request for funds to design the portion of the Mass Central Rail Trail from Priest Street to Felton Street. The first portion of the MCRT in Hudson will be completed by DCR as part of the Eversource transmission line project and extends to Wilkins Street in Hudson, where it merges with the Assabet River Rail Trail. And then the 2 trails separate again at Priest Street. So the next phase of the project would be from there at Priest Street through downtown Hudson to Felton Street. Last year, we received a DCR Mass Trails grant, which allowed us to conduct a feasibility study, survey work, and wetlands delineation for the remaining portion of the Mass Central Rail Trail in Hudson. And we obtained PRC approval for design of the next phase to Felton Street. And we'd really like to continue this momentum by completing that design. The trail would provide, safe off-road transportation and ADA compliant recreation to Hudson residents in areas of town without current access to these amenities. And it would provide regional connections to our very popular downtown, continuing the MCRT from Waltham, Weston, Wayland, and Sudbury to the downtown. And the project has a lot of support from residents in town, from the Ad Hoc Bicycle Committee, and from our Community Preservation Committee, who voted to approve $200,000 in matching funds. So we would really like to see this trail continued through Hudson. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Appreciate you joining the meeting to offer that comment. Eric.
Yep, thank you, Pam. Pam, Eversource is building that piece of the trail through Sudbury and a part of Hudson, correct? Do you know when that is going to be open? And does that connect directly to this piece that you guys are planning?
So so DCR is planning to start paving very soon. They have funds that need to be spent by the end of June, and they plan to use them for paving. So I don't know exactly when the trail will be open, but I know the paving is about to begin, and they're hoping to get the paving done by the end of June this summer. So then they'll still have some other amenities they'll need to do at the road crossings and things like that. It will connect, so it connects to the Assabet River Rail trailhead.
That's right.
And from there, the two trails will merge for about a mile or so, and then at Priest Street they'll separate again, and that is where we want to start the next portion.
Yeah. So your portion really continues many miles of trail for Mass Central that's going to be open probably sometime this summer or fall.
Yes, absolutely, and that's why we were really excited about having this momentum to start, and we really wanted to push it along and continue it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Are there any other members of the public who would like to speak at this time? Great. Seeing none, I will hand it over to Ethan to bring us to the first item of our agenda.
Excellent. Thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another TIP committee meeting. My name is Ethan Lapointe. I'm the TIP manager, and I'm also joined here today with Adriana Jacobson, who has been very involved in our TIP scoring process for this past year, just to give you an update on something we talked about at the March 6th MPO meeting, and that is the rescoring process for projects that are currently funded on the TIP. If we can go to the next slide and the one after that, please. I'll just give a quick overview of how this presentation is going to be laid out. I'll mostly set some context as to why project rescoring is conducted, lay out constraints in the actual rescoring process, highlight 2 potential improvements to the rescoring strategy going forward. They would not be deployed in time to do anything for this TIP development cycle, and also have discussion. I'd like to kind of target having half the time of this presentation being for that discussion phase, since I think that's fairly important. So in the interest of that, if we can go on the next slide, I'd like to set some context. And this is going to take us back a year. During development of the federal fiscal years 2025 to 29 TIP, 6 out of 9 projects were proposed for delay from fiscal 25 to fiscal 26. It's also worth noting that in addition to those fiscal 26 delays, there were additional delays into fiscal 27 that led to deficit funding issues. And that deficit prompted some additional scrutiny from MPO members and MPO staff on the projects that had fallen into those years, specifically looking at any changes in their scopes or project histories. The reason being was that as staff tried to gather more information, staff found that there were certain projects that had been on the TIP, for example, maybe for just 6 years, but had project info or design histories extending well beyond that. As this exercise was conducted and staff gathered information from project proponents and tried to identify project records, there were 2 issues that were highlighted. The greatest issue was that that process identified multiple projects on the TIP with development timelines that were approaching or beyond 10 years, including some projects that had even been on the TIP for about almost 10 years. The secondary issue that was identified is that the actual process of trying to identify this information was highly time-consuming, but also largely incomplete. This was because data either lived in multiple different locations, project proponents may have had staff turnover, or the project scope may have changed entirely over a protracted period of the project being on the TIP. On the next slide, because of the deficits in fiscal 2027, there were 8 projects that were flagged during last year's TIP development cycle. And of those 8 projects, 4 of them had been evaluated under a criteria set that was employed that used a 134-point scale. These were 4 projects that were scored either during the development of the fiscals 2021 to 25 TIP or earlier, and there were 4 that were evaluated on a 100-point scale for the 2022 to 26 TIP or later. Thus, because they had different denominators in the scoring criteria, the project scores were not really an effective metric for cross-comparison between these projects, which meant that the MPO members had to rely on other metrics in order to try and evaluate or determine which projects should be selected. Now, the rescoring process as outlined in the TIP Project Cost Change Committee policies from 2021 does require that MPO members select specific projects to rescore, but in anticipation, given there were several years of significant surpluses emerging and also deficits now from projects being delayed across multiple TIPs, staff had used the TIP 25-29 development cycle to predict what projects may require a new score in the 2026 to 30 TIP. On the next slide, selecting a sample of 5. Now, this was initially presented at the March 6th MPO meeting. I'm not going to go into these specific projects in detail here, besides the fact that each of these projects were flagged either due to readiness concerns, delays that were seen last year, or the fact that many of these projects were funded on TIPs a fair number of years ago. You can see that in the first TIP column where some projects here were funded in the 2016 to 20 TIP, the 2020 to 24 TIP, etc. What is more important here is that of these 5 projects that were flagged on the next slide, only 2 out of the 5 actually really apply, I should say, this year to the readiness discussions that are underway for TIP development. There are a variety of different projects that, later in today's presentation I will be discussing, and only 2 of those projects would have been covered by rescoring had staff conducted them. On the next slide, it's also worth noting that during the attempt to rescore projects, there were also 3 projects that were not scored on the TIP. Now, 2 of these were project design funding line items that were added late in 25-29 development, too late to be scored prior to that, and also the reconstruction of Rutherford Avenue in the city of Boston, which was added to the TIP in 2016 to 2020, using the scoring metrics that were applied to it when it was included in the LRTP. Not necessarily through the TIP scoring criteria. So staff had set out to rescore those 5 projects plus these 3 projects, in addition to, I won't get into this in this presentation in depth, but also each of the project design projects that were not funded last year. Now, on the next slide, the goal here was that project rescoring would be done in tandem with the project scoring for new TIP projects for 26 to 30. The idea being it would be more efficient, given the resources and needs would be the same. However, because of a project application surge for this past TIP cycle, which meant that there were 29 new applications to consider, that compounded the lift for the 14 that were planned for rescoring. In prior TIP development years, there were much lower application volumes, so this was not considered much of a concern at the time, when at least these projects were selected and forecasted back in August, September. It's also worth noting that as new project applications, those projects received more of the priority work for the rescoring process. And there's actually some other reasons for that as well, just besides them not having been scored yet. Namely, on the next slide, a project application that's new is more complete. It actually has an application form that the proponent fills out, submits to MPO staff with all attachments. And because of how application forms have been modified in recent years and will continue to be modified, they neatly align with the MPO scoring process. In a sense, the MPO's criteria that are used for evaluation are like a rubric for an essay that is the form of the actual project application. Older projects, however, especially ones that were funded over, 5 years ago or so, often not only lacked in any updated materials or information to reflect their latest designs or any scope changes, but because of different sources of data and locations, may not have had files at all to use for reference. It's worth noting that the design pilot projects from last year were actually quite easy to rescore, but the projects that we were looking at on the more capital-intensive side, not so much. Rescoring, therefore, meant that MPO staff had to go directly to project proponents to solicit information from the proponent and not necessarily in the form of a new application, more of a way of saying, do you have any updated materials to describe your project? This is a distinction that's important because it also meant that MPO staff had to initiate much of the work of soliciting this information rather than requiring that proponents bring that to the MPO outright. When proponents did provide this information, it was still either incomplete in some cases or it was inconsistent between the projects. A proponent may provide, for example, a 25% design submission, a utility report, intersection control evaluation waiver requests, their project need form, which may itself be 7 or 8 years old at that time. And as a result, it wasn't that helpful for benchmarking between projects. There was a solution that emerged as the rescoring process took shape, though it wouldn't be timely to the TIP development cycle. And that was basically saying that if your project is being rescored, you should have to submit a new application. Now, on the next slide, before we actually get into some of the process improvements that may be proposed, I'd also like to note some other constraints that are more minor but still important to consider. For one, staff turnover on the MPO side of things led to more difficulty in navigating the scoring process. There were some project proponents who were entirely new to the MPO TIP scoring process themselves, but also on staff side, we had some new program managers for congestion management processes and also vacancies on some of our other programs like climate resilience and air quality. And it's worth noting that climate resilience and air quality represents about 40% of the points that can be earned on a TIP application. So there were also some course corrections and adjustments and adaptations that staff were doing as well. Moreover, there were also some changes to the planned criteria that would be in place during the scoring process, which hindered the ability for the MPO to solicit feedback from applicants. Generally, the MPO staff try to solicit feedback on scores from applicants in early February before scores are finalized towards March. Due to some changes to the access and connectivity scoring methodologies that resulted from certain delays and refinement on the Conveil scoring methodology that was also presented at an earlier MPO meeting, that was not able to be accomplished in time this year. So those are two minor additions onto this. But on the next slide, I want to go into some ways that these things can be improved before I move into discussion on this. First off, one potential improvement, and these are both complementary to one another, is that there could be a designated time of year or just an initial onset of work where a broad swath of TIP projects are rescored. Based on the outcomes of this TIP development cycle for 26 to 30, the MPO board and/or this committee could develop a list of projects to be rescored during the summer following TIP endorsement. There are about 12 projects on the TIP right now that are using, for example, that 134-point scale. And one of the key elements here is that the rescoring process, doing it in a summer stage, would not conflict with or draw resources away from the scoring process for any new projects. The summer also tends to be a quieter time in TIP development, which means that that additional time to rescore could mean that there's additional time to gather further information and feedback from proponents. However, this is not only not timely to TIP development for 2630, but it also is not timely necessarily for TIP development for 27 to 31, as that scoring process will not take place until winter of 2027 into 2028, or winter of 2025 into 26, nor would it also take shape during the scenario planning, which is next March. It also is inefficient from the sense that there would be two separate scoring seasons, and it's more of a reactive approach. Though there are some benefits, for example, by scoring a large batch of 12 projects now, that is not something that necessarily has to be done annually, because rescoring a project that was scored recently is easier than scoring a project that was scored 8 years ago, especially if the data is organized well. And on the next slide, just for the last potential improvement, this comes back to something I mentioned earlier about new applications for scoring. I think we're just waiting on the slide. I think there's a couple technical difficulties we're running into today, but there we go. Perfect. This one, as the name,
Seeing the slides, if I might.
Are they not moving properly, or?
Maybe it's just for me. Thanks.
Oh, okay. I can. Yeah,
we can sorry, I can just try your screen.
I'm seeing new applications now.
Okay, I think we're on the right slide then. I'll just continue. I'm happy to reiterate since we're almost in the discussions. Thank you. I was gonna say if we can go back before we go to discussion. As the new application slide would suggest, this would require that any proponents of projects that are designated for rescoring must submit a new application to the TIP. The primary benefit here is that rescoring information would be consistent and complete with a brand new application, just as new project applications often are. And it also creates a consistent base of stored project information so that information is not found by either consulting with a variety of different potential stakeholders or consulting with several different databases where all this information currently lives. The drawback, of course, is that this is very labor intensive from the project proponent, and projects need to be identified before October so that those new applications could be submitted concurrent with the new project applications or scores. There's also a matter of optics on the project proponent side, as if a project proponent without sufficient communication is requested to submit a new application, they may believe that their project status could be in jeopardy as a result of needing to reapply on the TIP, as it were. That is not necessarily the case with something like this. But again, both the new application process and having a summer rescoring to take a crack at a broad swath of projects are not necessarily exclusive. They're just two proposed ideas that staff want to float before the committee here today and gauge interest in. So with that, I'm happy to either reiterate anything that I've said here, should folks may have missed something, and also just field any questions.
Thanks, Ethan. Appreciate those two options. And yeah, I'll open it up to questions and thoughts from committee members first? Len.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, we need the information, right? We're not right. I'll just say we need the information. I was just saying right to myself. And so we just and I feel that we we should tell the proponents that we need the information. It doesn't matter of asking them, will you please give us the information? Because you're doing us a favor. It's like, we need the information. Tell us when you can get the information to us. And we'll try to accommodate as much as we can, because we realize that you are people and you're usually dealing with insufficient resources. We understand that, but still we need to get that information in order to be able to make assessments, of the project just by itself, but also in comparison to other projects. With all these kinds of processes, what we need to make sure we do is that we treat all proponents equally. And so to the extent we can tell people what to expect and when, and make it clear that those standards are going to apply to everybody, then I don't think we'll ever get accused. Well, we wouldn't legitimately get accused of favoring any proponent over another. So in terms of what we do, yeah, I would say let's score what we can, during the summertime, and rescore. But in the process of rescoring, we are getting, the information that we need. And as you said, it's easier to rescore. But I guess in a broader sense, in terms of understanding how the scoring process works, I would like to think that there is some level of automation, not requiring so much conveyor, but then like if you have a spreadsheet that gives you like the +1 or +2 or whatever, it's probably contingent upon some words that are in certain cells. And so I could see us having like little labels or whatever tags that we apply, so that as we go through the applications, we can plug those in, and the numbers come out. But I think I'm maybe getting a little out of scope for the question you're asking. And I see Jay's hand up, so I'll stop talking. Thanks.
Thanks, Len. Jay.
Thank you. And Len, always great comments, so no worries. Happy to always listen to your thoughts.
Thanks.
Scoring has been a really key part of what the MPO and CTPS has done as long as I've been on the MPO. It really steers proponents, to develop a project that meets, regional goals, statewide goals, mobility goals. But I always caution, it's great for guiding a project, but when you start comparing projects against one another with a score and only with a score, it becomes a little problematic, because you're comparing projects at different sizes, different costs. We've talked about how using it as a cost benefit, but the way the scoring works really doesn't work in a cost benefit way. We don't say a bike lane costs, so many dollars per mile, or a bus lane so many dollars per mile. So it's really not a cost benefit analysis, and that's fine. Like I said, for developing a project, early stages and keeping everybody in the same kind of playing field, is great. But I just want to be careful as we talk about rescoring that we're clear about why we're doing it. And if the reason is because we're trying to make projects compete against one another because we don't have enough room on the tip, or because we're trying to nail things, I just want to be very careful with that, because I think it could be open to some wide interpretation. Before I give any broad opinion, I think maybe I just want more clarity on that. Is what are we actually doing with these rescores? What's the purpose? And it may just be we want to make sure everybody's still kind of heading in the right direction. But I'm not quite on board if we're going to start kind of pitting projects against one another. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay. Any other members have initial thoughts? Tom.
Thanks, Jen. This is a question for Ethan. With this rescoring, do you have any sense at all of, especially on the municipality side, that people will just give up? their project. Thinking that they've already gone through the scoring, they've done all the work, and like Jay just said, and that they might have limited resources. Are we concerned that some people, even though they've been on the they've had their project in for a long time, now they have to go through the rescoring again? Just trying to get a feel if we think that some groups may just decide, this isn't going to happen. Why should I go through this again? So just a little bit concerned on my end. Thanks.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to some of that. So because we did attempt the rescoring this past fall, we did have project proponents submit some information. Often it was incomplete. I would also note that while MPO staff did attempt to rescore in some cases to the best of our ability, we did not want to publish an incomplete rescore. So for example, some proponents gave us enough information to tell us enough about access and connectivity work and our mobility and reliability criteria for those MPO goals, but we didn't have much on the explanation of like climate resilience work for their drainage, MS4 standards, other things like that. And those were cases where a staff member, or I should say a municipal staff member, may not have had the time to address that. In other cases, we haven't heard any resistance from municipalities saying we're not going to reapply, though I would imagine that similar to the request that was made for information today from project proponents for readiness updates and schedule updates, that if a municipality did not want to contribute that additional information, that it would likely lead to further scrutiny against their project, should they opt to do so. Given the project is currently on the tip and funded, that is not necessarily a guarantee of continued funding if the proponent does not furnish additional information as things evolve, especially for projects this would mostly apply to projects that were selected 5 years ago or more. So things have also evolved since.
Yeah, and I'm also happy. Sorry, yeah, I'm also happy to speak to any details about the scoring or rescoring processes. That was something that I took point on, and yeah, I think a lot of the older projects just don't have some of the very specific questions about public engagement, as an example, or flood mitigation, that kind of thing, that we don't necessarily want to penalize them for not having that information on hand. But I do think it would be useful, maybe not necessarily to have them submit an entirely new application, but to kind of narrow down the questions that are missing, and just so that they're able to get all the points that they deserve. But I agree with Ethan, it wouldn't really be fair to publish the scores, not having given them the opportunity to provide that information.
Len.
Yeah, I just have no problem with me asking a project that's been around for a long time to reapply. Especially if it's not our fault, or MassDOT's fault. I use the word fault lightly, that their project hasn't been completed. And I appreciate what Jay is saying about not making the process competitive, but it is kind of inherently competitive, because there are more projects, there is funding, at least this year, or in any given year when we have a potential deficits. So we need to pick on some basis, and what the scoring does is try to make that selection process more objective. Instead of having like 100 people come to a meeting and say we love our project, and that be the basis by which we decide that we're going to do a project. We're trying not to simply accommodate or make our basis, our judgment, emotional based on appeal or whatever. So that's why I care for this process, so much. And I really value the scores. And even though we don't have costs, well, let me phrase this. We don't do CBA in a formal way, although we tried that maybe a couple of cycles ago. I certainly do that on my own, and I tend to look at the equity values, and there are metrics that I care about more than others, and those help me, determine which project in a tight call I would select. And so the only other thing I'll add, and this is a bit of a curveball, but I think one thing that we care about a lot in this process is trying to predict which projects are going to be delayed. And that'd be a nice kind of score to have. It's like, based on everything that we're seeing, what is the likelihood that this project is going to move forward, when they say they're going to move forward, because that would help us allocate funds in a given year, so that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Erin.
Yeah, I just think that, before we would go to asking a project to reapply, that is a tough hurdle. That's a lot of cost. It's a lot of time. And so I think we really want to know why there's a delay, why we think that a project may no longer, kind of be worthy of this tip. And I would say, yes, competitive funding, but that is not insignificant. So I think if we are ever at the point of thinking that we're going to take someone off entirely and they're going to need to reapply, I think we need to have some serious conversations with the appropriate people in those municipalities so that they understand what's being contemplated.
Thanks, Erin. And I guess maybe jumping off of that, Ethan, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to whether, like, for my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the intent of this isn't to necessarily say, that these projects that are being rescored are being contemplated to be removed, so much as it is to provide us with the information we might want to have to make decisions around, whether, I think like this year, for example, we're having to decide about which projects get delayed. And I think to Erin, your point, like we definitely want to understand the readiness aspects. And I guess at least in my mind, there's also an aspect to, readiness being equal. Like the other factor is kind of what is it about this project that is aligned with the MPO and what we want to see. So the score is kind of having, another ingredient there. So anyway, Ethan, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that intent.
Yeah, I think to Jen's question, regardless of readiness circumstance, like let's, as a hypothetical, say that there are no projects proposed for delay or cost increase. Even then, there is still a substantial gap in knowledge available to understand the projects as they currently are. This was not mentioned in this presentation, but members have expressed interest in previously, like TIP before and after studies, and without also having a better understanding of where the project proponents are coming from with their projects now, especially for these older projects, it would be difficult to judge whether or not the benefits that they are delivering once they reach construction would also be as robust. So part of this as well is not to target these projects, or there's about a dozen or so I think that would apply for this broad initial rescoring, more just to set a baseline to build off of so that there's just a better repository of this data, especially for the rescoring. And that would therefore also make it theoretically an easier lift in the future, so that potentially project proponents would not need to file a new application if this came up. Especially in the context of the summer rescoring proposal, given that is not happening during TIP development, it would technically give proponents more time to adjust, I think. And also because it is not in the heat of TIP development, I think it may be a lower pressure environment to do so as well. So the consequences aren't as major, and it would give us a better foundation to build off of for future TIP development activities.
Thanks, Ethan. I see Jay and then Dennis.
Just some quick food for thought here. Projects that score high tend to be more complex projects. And, speaking from an urban community, our projects are all complex because we've got environmental issues, we've got transit, we've got, bike and ped. Complex projects also are probably more apt to have readiness issues because they're complex. So, and I think this sort of maybe fits Erin's comments a little bit, which is, we've got to be concerned about how likely these projects are going to be ready. And we might just want to balance that with, that project that was maybe smaller, maybe in a more suburban community, might be a little simpler, might be more apt to be ready than the big complex project in the urban area. I sound like I'm advocating against myself, but I just want to, we're here because we have readiness issues. And so, again, I'm all for a competitive process. I'm all for the scoring, but I think that there's a kind of a bigger story to be told when it comes to these readiness issues and cost issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay. Dennis.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. Ethan, can you talk a little bit about how many of these projects have not advanced, or how these projects advanced since first being put on the tip? I'm always concerned about projects that we put on the tip at 25% or even less, and then they stay there for year after year after year. There's no advancement toward any sort of further design element, which also contributes to a whole host of problems. But can you address how many of these projects fall into that category, that they have not been advanced in a design way?
I can't put a number on it immediately, but I can say that of these dozen or so projects, most of them were evaluated 5 or more years ago, in many cases over 7. And the TIP is a 5-year program. So given many of these projects are still programmed on the TIP, most, if not all of them, have encountered delays, either in the past or are currently proposed for delay. So some of these have struggled to progress. I believe there are some that are still not at 25% design on this list that I'm currently looking at right now. There are some, however, that are at 100% design. There's actually a sizable number of projects here on this list that would fall in fiscal 26. So the rescoring process as well this summer would be sort of beneficial to the retrospective development of the 2630 TIP, albeit not necessarily beneficial to the development of the 2731 TIP, assuming that the projects slated to advertise in 26 do in fact advertise in 26, if that makes sense.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Ethan. Thanks, Dennis. I am reminded that there is another item on the agenda, and I think we're predicting a substantial amount of time that we might want to talk about that. So I think my sense is that we haven't necessarily given a super clear direction to staff on the question of scoring, but I suspect we may want to have this conversation continue in another meeting. I guess I'll ask staff, are you amenable to that? Given that we maybe have a little bit of time until you begin that process.
Yes, we can explore the possibility of reintroducing this at the May meeting, which would likely be closer to when we would want to discuss summer rescoring and retrospectives anyways, so.
I can give a very quick answer to Dennis's question about these 5 projects and their last design updates. It's about 4 to 5 years for all their projects except for Ipswich, which had a design update in the past year.
Thanks, Adriana. All right. So how about we move on to the next content area? Right. Thank you. Back to Ethan on the programming scenarios connected to the previous conversation. But yeah.
Right, perfect. Thank you. All right. So this is a very light topic. That's sarcasm. This is the initial programming scenarios for the 2026-30 TIP. If we can go on to the next slide, there is a lot to this presentation, as Jen just indicated. As far as the overview here, I will start with just a statement of our main objectives for this presentation, some of the materials that are going to be incorporated in this meeting. I'll do a recap on the overall high-level TIP readiness situation, looking back at the readiness scenario. I'll also cover some readiness updates that have happened since I wrote March here. It should say February 20th. And what is constant between each of the 4 scenarios that are available on the MPO calendar, and I'll be discussing here today. I'll then go into each of those scenarios individually, and then highlighting how some of these scenarios differ from each other. And then, of course, the main focus here today is discussion. Now, as part of the objectives, which are on the next slide, Staff are going to be presenting the programming scenarios here today, but this committee will be requested to identify a scenario or scenarios that they would indicate preference towards for the MPO board. We are not asking the TIP committee to flag a specific scenario to pick here today, just indicate preference towards which way to inform next week's MPO meeting. The results of next week's MPO meeting will then inform our next TIP committee meeting on March 27th, where more direct recommendations will be made as towards the development of a final programming scenario. The scenarios that are going to be presented here today do not answer all potential questions. Namely, they do not program any new projects or new transit projects in fiscal 26. They also don't program any new roadway projects in fiscal 2030. Staff had developed these scenarios after taking in consideration stakeholder feedback, or a lack of stakeholder feedback in some cases, with a primary goal of attaining fiscal constraint. And this was all based on things that emerged after the February 20th MPO meeting for TIP Readiness. Now, with regard to these scenarios on the next slide, there are 4 fairly long scenarios that are incorporated as part of this presentation. These are available on the MPO meeting calendar. I'm going to discuss them later on, just at a high level. These are scenarios 1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D. It's worth noting that each of these scenarios are also including all of the federal fiscal year 2025 funded projects. While they are not part of future scenarios, we wanted to reflect them here so that members had them for reference with regard to Amendment 10 to the 25-29 TIP, which is currently underway. Each of the projects that are included in Amendment 10 are also appearing on this scenario, just as a point of reference. Each of the 4 scenarios that are listed here today are focusing on addressing the deficit in federal fiscal year 2027, and they each do so in a different way. These scenarios will be voted on at the March 20th MPO meeting, and in addition to these scenarios that will be presented, there will also be a project description list for each of these projects that will be provided for reference there as well. The results of next week's MPO meeting will deliver scenario batch 2, so you can look forward to scenario 2A, 2B, etc. at the March 27th MPO TIP committee meeting. I do want to note on the next slide something that is mostly absent, with a couple of exceptions I want to highlight, which are our project updates. At a previous meeting, the MPO had requested that staff solicit updates from project proponents for projects that were either at risk or flagged for delay, or that had not seen design submissions in quite some time. The due date for this is March 13th, so there's still about 3 or more hours to submit additional updates, but as of the writing of this presentation, only 4 project proponents have actually responded to that request. These proponents were the City of Boston, which represents 3 projects on the TIP, the Town of Brookline, City of Salem, and the Town of Swampscott. It's worth noting here, the City of Salem had actually reached out but did not have a project, which was their Boston Street project, that was flagged for review on this list. Boston Street saw a design submission last year, and its cost estimate is both accurate and has not indicated any need for delay during this TIP cycle. And while they are not listed here, the Town of Milford did reach out with regard to the Route 16 improvements project that is in their community, but the Town of Milford is not the proponent for that project, and they largely reached out to distinguish that. It's worth noting that as additional project updates come forth, MPO staff will provide them, but also worth noting here that the majority of projects that were flagged, we still are pending additional information and reports on. On the note of readiness, I'll just recap very briefly on the next few slides. So I mentioned earlier Amendment 10. As members may recall, federal fiscal year 2025 saw, for really some of the first times in a TIP cycle, some out-year delays moving into the first year of the TIP, and that drove a substantial unprogrammed balance in that year that was not covered by 2630 scenarios or TIP development, but is incorporated in Amendment 10 and is already reflected on these scenario spreadsheets. In 26, there were still widespread delays in that year, where project delays out of federal fiscal year 2020, or I should say, if we can go on to the next slide. In 26, there were still fairly widespread project delays in that year, which also drove a large unprogrammed balance. But whereas in previous years, almost all of this funding that was shifted would result in a complete surplus, the delays of projects out of 25 into 26 reduced that anticipated surplus. However, on the next slide, the net impact to federal fiscal year 2027 also led to a deficit. That net impact was basically the same, bringing it down to almost negative $85 million. Also, because there was only one project delayed out of fiscal 27, despite that being a fairly low number of delays, there were low contingencies in that year and also some cost increases in that year, which also promulgated a delay. Now, it's worth noting here, this is the readiness scenario. This deficit that says negative $85 million is actually much smaller than what will be appearing in some of the slides later. That's because of some of the constants that I will get to on a later slide. But for now, I just want to kind of reiterate where we have started. And on the next slide, besides the deficits in 27 and 8, there were also very low funding balances in fiscal 29 and 30, which tempered funding availability, specifically on the next slide, highlighting how the deficits between 2027 and 28 exceeded funding availability overall across all 5 years of the TIP, especially between 2029 and 2030, which was highlighted to say that last year's strategy of delaying projects back multiple years to address the deficit may not be a feasible approach. There's been some updates since. Specifically, as we get onto the next slide, I'd like to go into those updates. Something that I want to tag first is that there were 7 projects that were initially proposed for delay by MPO staff based on some MassDOT recommendations out of federal fiscal year 2026. Now, we've actually received some updates on some of these as of about 2 hours ago, I think, and some coordination with these project proponents to that effect, coordination which is in some cases ongoing and upcoming, has brought that figure down from 7 projects to 5 projects. However, there are still some major considerations with these 2 projects that were taken out of the delay pool. Now, I'll get into the specific projects in the next few slides, but the bottom line outcome of these changes is that this has substantially reduced the deficit that is in fiscal 27 at the expense of also reducing the financial surplus in 26. Namely, if we can go on the next slide, I'd like to talk about the Boylston Street project in the city of Boston. Now, this table on screen here illustrates in the left column the readiness scenario status, or the status proposed for the project initially at TIP readiness days. In the case of Boylston Street improvements in the city of Boston, the project was flagged for a delay to fiscal 27 with a funding amount of $8.3 million. This largely being the result of needs for coordination and permitting for assets that were not owned by the city of Boston as part of the project, specifically assets that were owned by DCR. Now, since that initial presentation at Readiness Days, the City of Boston is in the process of removing the intersection of Brookline Avenue and Park Drive from the scope of work and is working with MassDOT to get a new project review committee approval for the project this coming spring so that the new scope can be reflected in there, a new 25% design can be submitted, and that the city can move towards a combined 75 and 100% design submission. It's also worth noting, as part of the schedule updates that the City of Boston prepared for this meeting, the consultant for the contract has prepared an approximate updated cost estimate of about $10.2 million for the project. So this is an increase by a little less than 25%, but this project also has an updated cost estimate as it holds position in 26. MPO staff are continuing, though, to monitor progress on design here, especially with regard to the need to advance through project review committee, a new 25, 75, etc. Also worth noting here that because the Boylston Street project was added to the TIP quite some time ago, staff are still in the process of rescoring this project, particularly inclusive of this scope change. On the next slide, there is one other project that was also flagged for potential delay to fiscal 27. This is one I have a few more updates on besides what is listed on screen here. This is the improvements on Route 3A from Otis Street and Cole Road, including Summer Street and the Rotary, and Rockland Street to George Washington Boulevard. So the Route 3A project in Hingham was originally proposed for delay to fiscal 27 with a funding amount of about $33.2 million. It's worth noting here that one of the reasons for this delay was that as design had progressed past 25% design, MassDOT, which was beginning to lead the project further in coordination with the town of Hingham, began to incorporate additional needs, given this is a coastal roadway, into the project to address some outdated drainage improvements that were necessary as a result of deferred maintenance in the project area. However, with the introduction of this new drainage into the project scope of work, that required the potential for new permitting needs, which may not only incur additional cost changes to the project based on discussions with the municipality, but also would potentially incur delays to the project into 27. Now, based on some discussions with the project proponents here, these scenarios currently reflect in each case the project being funded in federal fiscal year 2026. Now, discussions between MassDOT District 5 and the municipality are ongoing, and there is, I believe, a scheduled meeting in the coming week between District 5 and the town of Hingham. Due to the cost estimate for this project, because the project cost is fairly substantial, only scenario 1C is proposing fully funding the project in fiscal 26. All of these scenarios fund it starting in 26, but spread that funding into fiscal 27 in the event that there are additional delays that could emerge or cost increases in the event it does not hold 26. And this is an incorrect programming figure, which would be something that would become clear over the coming months. How this funding is actually spread out is consistent between scenario 1A and 1D, but differs slightly in scenario 1B. And for just the third update I would like to highlight here, this is the Main Street reconstruction project in the town of Wakefield. Before we start, I would like to note that the town of Wakefield is working with their consultant to develop an updated schedule and submission for the project to kind of reflect also an updated cost estimate that has been flagged. Now, the project is currently programmed in fiscal 28 for $18.4 million and has a revised cost estimate of $28.5 million. It is very closely or nearly, based on their schedule, going to achieve 25% design. I believe the current 25% design submission date is mid-March, and we are in almost mid-March. The project itself is one of three, and I say related here on the slide, but really contiguous efforts in downtown Wakefield. Now, as part of TIP development in federal fiscal year 2025 to 29, due to some readiness challenges that emerged on the total length of the Wakefield-Linfield Rail Trail project, that project was selected to be phased into different components. And one section of that rail trail was also included in a roadway reconstruction project on Main Street. The town of Wakefield actually has two connecting, a north and south part, projects on Main Street, with the MPO voting to fund the larger or northernmost project back during the 2024 to 28 TIP. There have been discussions over the past few months to resolve some of the coordination matters that were regarding these three projects. And now, as part of this scenario, each of these scenarios reflect the new cost estimate for this project, which distinguishes it from the revised scope for the rail trail and the Southern Roadway project. The Southern Roadway project is not on the TIP currently, and funds accordingly. The cost increase for this project in scenario 1B is funded in fiscal 29, whereas all other scenarios fund the cost increase in full in fiscal 28. And I'll reiterate again, the town of Wakefield is currently working with their consultant to get further updates on how this project is developing. With that, if we can move on to the next slide, I would like to speak about a related item here on the next slide. So these next few slides are going to cover some projects that are the same across all scenarios, and that they are funded or represented consistently across each four options, but were not originally included during the readiness scenarios that were presented back on February 20th. This first project is what would normally be called a fill-in project, proposed for this scenario outright. I would also note it is not yet scored because it was proposed after the project scoring period. This is the rail trail construction from Ford Avenue to Nichols Lane of the Linfield Rail Trail. So as I just mentioned on the prior slide, the full length of the Wakefield-Linfield Rail Trail was previously proposed and funded in the MassDOT statewide highway program as one entire project. But as design progressed along the corridor, different sections of the trail were flagged for having different readiness dates or permitting needs, and as a result, the project was broken up into several phases. However, these discussions took place during 2025 to 29 TIP development, and by the time different phases were identified, this specific phase, which was approaching 100% design, could only be funded in federal fiscal year 2029 of the statewide highway program. The project is now at 100% as of February 6th, and the town of Linfield has for some time now been advocating to MPO staff and MassDOT staff to advance and accelerate this phase of the trail into federal fiscal year 2026. The cost estimate as a result of the 100% for this project is $6 million and is reflected in all scenarios here. If we can go on to the next slide, I'd like to talk about what this relates to. Yeah, Eric.
Can I just, for context, just for folks who aren't as familiar with the trail projects, so that Linfield Wakefield Trail connects to the Danvers Rail Trail, which then connects basically all the way up further north. So it's not just like a little piece on its own. It connects to a lot of things. And then we're working with like Melrose and Malden to try to, there's not like rail right of way anymore after that. And so we're working with them to create kind of a higher end facility like on street that kind of weaves down and actually goes all the way to the Mystic River path. So I just want folks to know a lot of money, you know, these projects, but these things actually connect to other things that are happening.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And that project with the inclusion in fiscal 26 is meant in part to address this next project, which I'll get into here. And these are two related projects within the city of Chelsea, both of which would, under the readiness scenario, be included in fiscal 27. Now, as a refresher from TIP Readiness Days, as a result of Readiness Day's recommendations, there were 4 projects programmed within the city of Chelsea in fiscal year 2027, which drove some concerns from staff at the city around traffic control coordination for these projects. Now, one of these 2 projects was the targeted safety improvements and related work on Broadway in Chelsea. Now, this project had actually begun in the statewide highway program and was itself a fill-in selected during the federal fiscal years 2024 to 28 TIP, but was delayed this year out of 26 into 27. It is worth noting for the Broadway project that it was actually scored, I believe, during the 2021 to 25 TIP by the MPO, but due to fiscal constraint was not selected. And MassDOT funded it there. So there has been some back and forth between regional and statewide prioritization with this project, and that continues with this TIP, as it is being proposed to leave fiscal 27, return to statewide prioritization in exchange for MPO prioritization of the currently statewide highway-funded Linfield Rail Trail project. In addition to the Broadway project moving from regional prioritization to statewide, the City of Chelsea has requested that the Park and Pearl Street project be removed from the 2026 to 30 TIP window entirely, instead targeting funding in next year's TIP cycle for federal fiscal year 2031. Now, it's worth noting that the Park and Pearl Street project has not encountered any delays since it was initially funded in fiscal 27 of the 2023 to 27 TIP, and the City of Chelsea has spent the past few years doing a lot of public engagement around the project. The city has also been warned by MPO staff that there is uncertainty as to the ability to fund this project in federal fiscal year 2031, given we are only developing the 2026 to 30 TIP. The decision by the city to seek funding in a later TIP cycle is one that does not necessarily guarantee a spot in that later TIP cycle, as that the funding amounts and allocations for that year are not yet indicated. These 2 actions, by moving one project to statewide prioritization again, the Broadway project, and moving Park and Pearl Street in Chelsea out into a later TIP, would reduce the fiscal 27 deficit by $21 million, and each scenario already factors these in. And if we can go on to the next slide, I'd like to then move into some updates on the design funding proposals here. So, in anticipation of the possibility that there will be additional funding available in fiscal 26 of this TIP, staff rescored projects from the 2025 design pilot to be reconsidered. This scenario, or I should say each of these 4 scenarios, include 4 new projects for $3.6 million, and they are the same 4 projects. Each scenario is also incorporating, starting in fiscal 27, a project design set-aside fund. This set-aside fund is $2 million in fiscal 27 and $3 million in each subsequent year. The target amount for these set-asides is about 2 to 3 design projects per year going forward. Now, The project design pilot for fiscal 25 funded 6 projects, and this current proposal may fund only 4 new projects, but there are 2 other design projects already on the tip, one for the Route 126-135 grade crossing in Framingham, the other for the Route 4225 at Route 128 interchange in the town of Lexington. So there's still 6 projects for design fiscal 26. The reason why this set aside is targeting a lower number of projects per year going forward is not due to lack of demand per se, but to prevent potential oversubscription to construction funding in future TIP years, especially recognizing that this year has seen a heightened amount of project applications already for construction funding in outer years of the TIP, especially relative to the MPO's funding availability to actually support them. Moreover, as the Boston Region MPO has advanced its project design pilot process, other MPOs in the Commonwealth are also developing and advancing their own. And many of the resources that are allocated to support the design development process are centralized to MassDOT Highway Division headquarters, specifically the contracts office, in order to make sure that as other MPOs begin to advance their own design projects, that these projects can be effectively managed. We do not want to overburden a shared and centralized resource, at least based on this scenario proposal. So there's both a project readiness and financial reason as to why we're scaling back some of the design pipeline here. With that, if we can go on to the next slide, I'll go into each of the 4 projects that are included in this design funding proposal. The first being the reconstruction of Route 2A 119 Great Road in the town of Acton from Davis Road to Harris Street. This is a budget request for $860,000. Now, to a point that was made earlier during the rescoring process, I'd like to just talk about the project score for a bit. This project has a 41 out of 100 score on it, but that is largely because in addition to the project largely focusing on vulnerable road user safety improvements in an area where there's no sidewalks and there's no bicycle facilities, despite the project being close to the Bruce Freeman rail trail. This project is also in an area that has a very large concentration of existing multifamily housing developments. Now, I believe there are policy changes underway or being worked on right now locally that would enable future development, but given the concentrated nature of existing development, this project did not earn many points in the scoring process because there were not many future developments. And because it largely focused on residential, there were other factors as well that were working against it on mixed use, commercial, public space, etc. This is an example of a project, and there are several others like this already funded on the tip that focuses on certain aspects of the MPO vision and goals quite well in specific areas, but is not necessarily a generalist in that way. With that said, this is still a complete streets project that would improve user safety throughout the corridor, but I just wanted to flag that because I anticipated a question with regard to its score here. On the next slide, on the subject of trails here, we then have the proposal for the design of the Massachusetts Central Rail Trail extension from Felton Street to Priest Street. The budget request here being for $909,700. Now, the maps that I'm showing on screen here were from last year's presentations on how these projects scored. 2 of these projects, Hudson being one of them, have maps that are no longer reflecting the actual limits of the work that's being proposed here. The limit that is shown on screen spans from the proposed terminus of the underway Mass Central Rail Trail extension in Hudson near Priest Street, all the way to the Berlin border. This would only go to Felton Street to the west, but still include that one section that runs alongside the Aspet River Trail. And this would further the extension of the MCRT into downtown Hudson and finish and complement that connection into the Aspet. It's also worth noting that in addition to this funding request, the town is also working with DCR to support Mass Trails grant applications for the potential to either complement this funding source from the MPO or to further extend the trail into neighboring communities. It's also worth noting here, I'll just say, that with the completion of the Mass Central Rail Trail through Hudson, that would be the westernmost section of the MCRT through the entirety of the Boston region, as Berlin is not in the region. And on the next slide, also similar issue here on the just maps, which we're still in the process of updating, is the design improvements on Route 60 in Malden. These would be phase 1 and 2 from Franklin Street to Lynn Street. Originally, this project was proposed as one entire project from Pleasant Street going under the orange line all the way to Lynn Street. At project initiation and review committee, the city of Malden initiated 3 separate projects based on anticipated delivery timelines and roadway resurfacing needs. Thus why it says phase 1 and 2 in here. Phase 3 is actually currently being advanced on a faster timeline, somewhat counterintuitively to its naming convention, with the potential to pursue a municipal paving grant. So it is no longer included in the funding request where it was originally last year. This project still includes investments in bus transit priority and sidewalk level cycle tracks along a very much mixed use and transit heavy corridor, including multiple connections to transit modes and the Northern Strand bike path. And the 4th and final project here is in the city of Salem for the Broad Street and Dalton Parkway corridor design project with a request for $1,068,000. This project largely focuses on a road diet across multiple streets, which are both near to new housing development proposals and some adaptive reuse sites. This project on the southwest section also invests in safety measures for vulnerable road users near Collins Middle School and connects into downtown Salem. So with that, those are the 4 design requests that are included in every scenario for about $3.6 million here. I'll then move into the community connections projects that are funded here. In short, all 7 applications for community connections are funded in these scenarios. There are 5 applications here that are categorized under the Bike Share Capital programs. The first being from the city of Boston for the replacement of 20 blue bike stations, which amount to 380 docks. The second, a request for expansion into South Brookline by the town of Brookline for 3 stations and the procurement of 10 new e-bikes. The city of Cambridge is requesting funding for the replacement of 7 stations and purchase of 123 new bikes. The city of Chelsea is requesting 3 new stations for expansion, 28 new bikes, 3 new e-bikes. And the city of Somerville is asking to replace or purchase 40 new bikes, replace 40 docks, and replace 10 concrete slabs that support those docks. Now, in summary, between these 5 line items, there are 33 new stations proposed here. 6 of those are brand new stations. The other 27 are replacements. And there's 201 bicycles proposed for purchasing through Blue Bikes. This amounts to about $1.5 million of funding request. On the next slide, there are 2 other community connections requests. The first being from the town of Marblehead for a bicycle rack procurement for 22 racks for $6,250, and the second being from the city of Newton for bicycle rack, bicycle shelter, and rectangular rapid flashing beacon or RFB procurement. For Newton, that's 67 racks, 2 bike shelters, and 12 RRFBs. That amounts to about $480,000 between these 2 funding requests, which fits very neatly into the community connection set aside for federal fiscal year 2026 and the bike share support set aside. Yeah, Eric.
Do we have like a minimum, like 6,250? I mean, that seems like a really small amount for federal funds for this kind of stuff. Do we have any minimum?
I don't believe we have an official minimum. We have talked to the town of Marblehead about the funding amount. I do believe that the smallest, anecdotally, project that was funded was a bicycle rack procurement at Chainery Middle School in Belmont a few years ago, which I think was maybe $3,000.
Okay.
But I do understand where the sentiment is coming from on scale versus staff allocation to
I
support.
mean, I know we bundle these into like kind of one project that actually MAPC helps facilitate for MassDOT. So from a contracting standpoint, so it's not like all these little things. So all these kind of things do get like bundled into like one program, so to speak. But it might be something to think about. And I know we've heard from communities that have said like, it's hard to fund some of these small things, but it's a balancing act.
Yeah, and I agree. We're definitely looking into that for future application cycles for community connections because we're aware of the staff burden on it. With that, though, I'll just kind of summarize everything I just said on the next slide about what is consistent between each of the scenarios, and then I'll actually get into the scenarios. So each of the 4 scenarios I'm about to talk about funds 7 community connections projects. They create set-asides for design funding to be allocated in future TIPs, and they fund 4 additional projects for design in federal fiscal year 2026. There are some things I didn't mention. There's about $30,000 in 26 to support greenhouse gas monitoring activities as part of the MPO's performance-based planning program. This greenhouse gas monitoring activity is, in a way, a complement to TIP before and after analyses, as they would be installed near locations for upcoming TIP projects to better measure the extent to which MPO-funded projects are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions in a project area. These scenarios also program funding for that first phase of the Linfield Rail Trail in exchange to shifting the Chelsea Broadway Improvements Project back to statewide prioritization and shifting back the Park and Pearl Street project into an out year beyond the constrained period of the TIP. I'll also note here that transit providers, the MBTA and MWRTA, have indicated support to remove the $5.5 million that was currently set aside as funding for transit transformation for fiscal 27 applications, in the interest of reducing the deficit in that year, and also in recognition of the additional funding available this year in 26 and 25. The 25 funding already being captured in Amendment 10. So the transit transformation set aside for 27 is zeroed out in each of these scenarios. All of these scenarios also attain that fiscal constraint, that mandated requirement for TIP scenario development across all years of the TIP, but they all do so differently. So without further ado, on the next slide and the slide after that, I'd like to get into Scenario 1A. Scenario 1A primarily focuses on the fiscal 27 deficit by delaying two projects in the city of Lynn. Now, these two projects, and I'll get into them again on the next slide, but these are the rehabilitation of Essex Street, a project that was initially funded in the 2020 to 2024 TIP in fiscal 24, and was proposed for delay to fiscal 27 at Readiness Days. Now, this project, despite being on the TIP for about 6 years, is still not at 25% design and has a Project Review Committee approval date of December 2018. It has a cost estimate currently at about $23.6 million. The other project, the rehabilitation of Western Avenue in Lynn, was funded in a later TIP cycle, 2023 to 27, so only 3 years ago. However, it also is not at 25% design, and it actually has the same Project Review Committee approval date as the Essex Street project. This project has a cost estimate of about $44.3 million, so it's about $70 million almost of projects here within the city of Lynn that would be potentially impacted by these changes. On the next slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail as to what is actually being proposed here for the shifts. By delaying, or I'll explain a little bit what is on screen. So this table that's on screen here has 4 rows. The first 2 rows show the readiness scenario allocation for the rehabilitation of Essex Street, with the project delayed to fiscal 27 and fully funded in fiscal 27. The second row shows the rehabilitation of Western Avenue as of the readiness scenario, keeping the project in its start year of 28 with $15 million in 28, $20 million in 29, and fully funding the project in 2030 at $10.9 million. The lower 2 rows show what happens with scenario 1A in comparison. Essex Street would be delayed back instead of 1 year to 27, 2 years to fiscal 2028. Its funding would include $13.6 million in 28 and $10 million in fiscal 29. The rehabilitation of Western Avenue would also be delayed back 2 years to start in fiscal 2030, with other funding to be allocated in future TIPs. Now, it's worth noting here on the next slide that these funding adjustments just between these 2 projects attain fiscal constraint in each of the years of the TIP, with about $26.4 million in fiscal 26 and $45.8 million in fiscal 2030. The figures between 27 and 29 for remaining balances hover around 1%. On the next slide, I'll summarize a little bit what this scenario is really doing. Scenario 1A is focusing on 2 projects in the same municipality that would both currently have funding obligations of some form in fiscal 27 that do not have 25% design submissions to be delayed to attain fiscal constraint but not entirely removed from the TIP. Now, as part of the scenario, it is worth noting that there is a substantial readiness justification to move a pre-25% design project out of fiscal 27 into fiscal 28. And the Essex Street delay can be accommodated by moving Western Avenue, which means that it draws resources away from a different project in the city of Lynn versus a project in a different community. It Also, this is not necessarily a good thing here. This is why it says considerations and not pros and cons, but it shifts a substantial amount of cost risk, given these projects are not at 25% design, to the outer years of the TIP, including future cost obligations to the Western Avenue project, which could require additional years to funding the project. Right now it has a 3-year spread. A cost increase, given it's at $44 million without a 25% design, could require a 4th year of the spread. This strategy, for better or worse, is somewhat reminiscent of the approach that was taken in the development of the 2025 to 29 TIP. Now, on the next slide, while scenario 1A concentrates delays across one municipality, scenario 1B staggers delays across, and also some funding adjustments, across 5 communities. The projects in scenario 1B are the Norwood intersection improvements at Route 1 University Avenue, the rehabilitation of Washington Street in Brookline, rehabilitation of Western Avenue again in Lynn, the Spot Pond Brook Greenway in Malden, and the rail trail construction in Swampscott. Now on the next slide, I'm going to talk about each of these projects, and when I say staggered delays, what I'm really saying is that as each of these projects move back 1 year, they may create a deficit in the following year, and thus another project must move back. In the case of scenario 1B, starting with Norwood, the intersection improvements at Route 1 and University Avenue would be proposed for a delay of 2 years from 26 to 28 instead of its current proposal for 26 to 27. The project has a 25% design, but it's 4 years old, and the current cost estimate of $27.6 million does not reflect a culvert that has been added into the scope and additional drainage work. Now, by moving this project back out of 27 into 28, that resolves the fiscal 27 deficit, but creates a deficit in fiscal 28. Now, for Washington Street and Brookline, this project would not be delayed in this scenario, but would have its funding spread between fiscal 28 and 29, and then rebalanced, where the amount of funding that Brookline would, or the Washington Street project in Brookline would receive in 28 would be reduced by $5 million, and then increased by $5 million in fiscal 29. The Western Avenue project in Lynn would also be delayed to fiscal 29 to address the readiness concerns on the project and the deficit in 28. That would then, on the next slide, create a deficit in 29. So this is kind of a knock-on effect here. And so to address that deficit in fiscal 29, the Western Avenue project would again see a reduction in funding from $20 million to $10 million in that year. And there will be 2-year delays proposed on the Spot Pond Brook Greenway project in Malden and the Swampscott Rail Trail project in Swampscott. Worth noting that this slide was developed before we received the readiness update from the town of Swampscott. That readiness update actually currently indicates an early fiscal year 28 advertisement date for this project, which is even earlier than the readiness scenario's proposal for fiscal 29. With that said, the Swampscott Rail Trail project still does not have a new cost estimate provided to it, and as a result, it does still have some readiness and cost risk associated with it, which were also flagged in the schedule update. So this is to say that a 2-year delay on this project is fairly aggressive, a 1-year delay is more conservative, so not necessarily what's reflected here. None of the 3 projects between Western Avenue, Spot Pond Brook Greenway, and Swampscott are yet at a 25% design, and their cost estimates, as I just mentioned, are 2 years old for Spot Pond Brook at about $5 million, 5 years for the Swampscott Rail Trail at $8.6 million, and 6 years old for Western Avenue at about $44 million. On the next slide, I'll go into a little bit of an overview on this. Based on these sort of dominoes moving between projects across years, there's $30.4 million in fiscal 26. There's a higher amount of funding and reserves for 27 and 28 versus scenario 1A by a small amount. It's more like 2% instead of 1%. There's very little contingency in fiscal 29, and there's about $27.4 million in fiscal 2030. On the next slide, just to kind of give a very high-level summary on this, Scenario 1B would reserve more funding in the near-term years of the TIP for potential cost changes, but it has less funding overall across all 5 years of the TIP versus Scenario 1A, and it focuses on doing 2-year delays to 3 projects rather than focusing on a smaller group of projects. The remaining balances in 26, 7, and 8 are modestly higher than Scenario 1A, but those 29 reserves are pretty low, and there's only $27.4 million for any new needs in fiscal 2030, with new needs being defined as anything including, for example, additional advanced construction allocation to different long-range projects or any new projects there, or cost increases in future TIPs. It does distribute the impacts of this scenario across multiple projects and multiple municipalities, but some of these projects would be impacted with more severe delays than others in the name of attaining fiscal constraint. The cost to future TIP cycles, and when I say cost to future TIP cycles, what I really mean is the shifting of cost burdens from advanced construction out beyond after 2030 is less than other scenarios. I would classify scenario 1B as a financially conservative scenario, but not necessarily one that's risk averse. If we go on the next slide, that'll then take us into scenario 1C, which I would say is more loose on the financial side as far as allocations, but from a readiness perspective is also not necessarily as impactful to project delays. Scenario 1C rebalances project funding across 4 projects rather than relying on further delays of projects beyond what is already accounted for as of TIP readiness days, which is to say, Scenario 1C does not delay any extra projects. It moves funding between the years. There are 4 projects that would be affected here versus what's present in other scenarios. Improvements on Route 3A in Hingham, intersection improvements at Route 1 University Ave in Norwood, the McGrath Boulevard project in Somerville, and the rehabilitation of Western Ave in Lynn. On the next slide, to go into detail here. With regard to the Route 3A project in Hingham, this project would be fully funded in fiscal 26 for $32 million. The other 3 scenarios here spread that funding between fiscal 26 and 27 to alleviate the 27 deficit. Now, if this project were to be brought in full into 26, that would make a very substantial reduction in the 27 deficit. However, given some of the ongoing discussions and concerns about readiness on the project, it does inject a great deal of financial risk into the fiscal 26 program, given the current readiness position of the project is fairly bullish for fiscal 26, which is to say they are aggressively trying to meet a fiscal 26 add date at this time, the town and also MassDOT, though as permitting needs continue to arise, that fiscal 26 position may change over the coming months. With regard to the McGrath Boulevard construction project, to sort of finish out the remainder of the deficit in fiscal 27, the project would be reduced from $30 million to $25 million in its first year, and from $33 million in fiscal 28 to $25 million. Now, the project would still remain fully funded across all 4 years of the TIP. Those reductions in the first 2 years would be offset in year 4 of the project in fiscal 2030, going from a current balance of $35 million up to $48.1 million. So the McGrath Boulevard project would still be fully funded, but it would have a larger tail. And I'll explain what I mean by tail in a sec. For the other 2 projects, we go on the next slide. For the intersection improvements at Route 1 University Avenue, instead of being fully funded at $27.6 million in 27, it would be reduced to $17.6 million, and that $10 million would go to 28. That $10 million in fiscal 28 would allow it to be a hedge should this project be delayed into fiscal 28 in a future TIP, or once it sees a new 25% design submission, given the cost or the scope changes, or 75, it could also act as a hedge against potential cost increases in the future, as well as any potential readiness issues. And lastly, for the rehabilitation of Western Avenue, this project would be reduced to $10 million in fiscal 28 and 29. The federal fiscal year 2030 figure would go up to $20 million. Now, given this project is very likely to see a cost increase when the 25% design comes through, a 4th year of advanced construction funding would likely be required in federal fiscal year 2031 in a future TIP. Also a fair bit of uncertainty if a $10 million figure in fiscal 29 is actually sufficient to conduct the level of intensive construction work that would potentially need to be taken on a project in year 2 of construction after advertising. If we go on the next slide, I'll just briefly cover where the final funding pictures are at. In 26, scenario 1C has the lowest amount of funding in 26 at about $16.4 million, and it also has about $27.8 million in fiscal 2030. More of the funding is available in the middle years of the TIP, but not enough to fund new projects, more for reserves. This scenario largely is shifting funding between different TIP years to try to address various deficits without identifying any new uses, or I should say any additional large-scale capital uses for it, in order to resolve the deficits in those years in a fairly conservative position, but not necessarily addressing any of the readiness risks. On the next slide, I sort of reiterate that. So again, it does not, with scenario 1C, impact any project schedules beyond the readiness scenario, instead of shifting funding around. And the immediate financial impacts, and I know that's to future tips, and I know that kind of sounds weird, but basically to say the impact that this scenario would have on future tip cycles is less than other funding scenarios, which is to say this project is not necessarily increasing the MPO's funding commitments to be satisfied in future tips, but it is, by just moving funding and not necessarily delaying projects, not going to resolve any underlying risks on project costs, which could still be realized in a future tip cycle, or any readiness risks on these projects that could also be realized in the future. It also has the lowest funding allocation for any new uses in 26 or 30. And by relying on spreading the funding out, if any of these 4 projects were to be delayed in the development of next year's tip, those delays would impact multiple federal fiscal years. I mentioned a tail earlier. When I say a project's tail, what I'm saying is an advanced construction schedule for a project that allocates more money to the rear of the schedule than the front of the schedule. In this case, this scenario would create a large tail for McGrath Highway and Western Avenue, which would mean that they have greater impacts if those projects are delayed on those future tip cycles. Instead of talking about an additional $10 million in 2031, it might need to be $30 million in 2031 if they were to move back. And I mention this because this was a major factor as to why the Rutherford Avenue project's cost distributions were adjusted in the development of the readiness scenario for this year's tip. On the subject of the Rutherford Avenue project, if we move into scenario 1D, this project, or I should say this scenario, is very similar to scenario 1A. In fact, it is nearly identical, but its main difference is it includes an adjustment to the Rutherford Avenue project in tandem with Western Avenue. Instead of doing a 2-year delay for Western Avenue to fiscal 2030, Western Avenue would be delayed by 1 year to fiscal 29, and the Rutherford Avenue project in Boston would be delayed 2 years back to fiscal 2030 instead of a 1-year delay back to 29 as currently proposed. If we go on to the next slide, I'll discuss this in a little bit more detail. I'll say, rather, highlight the main difference here between scenario 1A and scenario 1D. Funding availability in 26 is about $26.4 million. In 2030, it's $45.8 million. These are identical funding balances to what's under scenario 1A. The big difference is what's highlighted in fiscal 29. The fiscal 29 reserves are much higher than the about 1% that's in scenario 1A. Instead, it's at about $20.3 million, or about 13%. On the next slide, I'll go into a little bit of detail as to what scenario 1D does in other ways. Primarily, scenario 1D is doing what I said earlier about shifting future funding obligations for large-scale capital projects to be addressed in future tip cycles. With Rutherford Ave, under this scenario, needing a cost schedule funded through 2034, assuming that $200 million cost estimate that is currently using holds. It's worth noting that with $33.5 million on the tip in 2030 alone, that leaves about $170 million of outstanding obligation for future tip cycles to address. With that said, unlike scenario 1A, scenario 1D does not focus entirely on projects in the city of Lynn and is still fairly conservative on the project readiness front. It also allocates further funding availability in later years of the tip than in other scenarios. This means there's more opportunity to either use those outer years of funding as reserves, given certain uncertainties with regard to project cost estimates or other potential sources of project cost increase resulting from different policy decisions, or any other new uses of funding. And I'll just close out the slide and then I'll answer Dennis's question. This is particularly relevant for fiscal 29. It is worth noting that with $20 million on the books in fiscal 29, that some of that $20 million could be shifted back to Rutherford Avenue. As a refresher for those who were present during 2024-28 tip development, the Rutherford Avenue project was programmed with $8.6 million in fiscal 27 as part of mobilization resources. Yeah, Dennis.
Thanks, Ethan. Couple questions. The 2 Lynn projects, are they linked in any way other than being in the same city?
They are not contiguous with each other, but I believe they are close to each other. The Western Avenue project is also part of a phased deployment that is ongoing and in some cases I believe already completed of bus priority infrastructure along Route 107. And I believe there are other projects in neighboring Salem that are also looking to make improvements along 107 as well.
Okay. And which of the two projects was the one that has not been updated design-wise for 7 years?
Neither of them are at 25%, and I believe both of them are in a 6-year position.
Okay.
The difference was when they were funded. One was funded 3 years ago, the other was funded about 6 years ago.
Which one was funded 6 years ago?
Essex Street in Lynn, which is currently proposed for fiscal 27 in the
27.
readiness scenario. Into these scenarios, it would go to 28.
Okay. I guess I would ask the question, why would we want to continue to fund a project that is that old, it hasn't advanced, and is causing year funding issues? Why would we just say, come back when you advanced it in a further design and we'll take a look at it again? We've had a lot of these projects that stay on the tip for long periods of time that really just stay on the tip and it doesn't get advanced in any sort of significant way. And these projects seem to cause us problems. And while we're trying to rotate things around and play, sort of number games, but at the end of the day, we do it all the time, and it just never seems to stop. I know it's probably a hard course to take, but it's frustrating that other projects are not being programmed because we have these projects that are taking up space but not advancing. It's just frustrating to me, and I just wonder, why do we continue to do that? I guess maybe a rhetorical question, but.
Yeah, I think thanks, Dennis. Definitely hitting at some of the tensions between kind of as kind of going back to the earlier conversation around rescoring and trying to figure out ways to differentiate between projects that are moving forward and those that may not be. All right. I do think Ethan, you had a couple more slides to go through. Maybe we'll do that and then continue the conversation.
Yes, I believe I'm about 2 slides away from discussion.
Okay.
So.
Well, is that all right with you, Jay and Len?
Of course, yeah, no problem at all.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. As far as closing thoughts here. So I want to reiterate, this is the first discussion that we're having on scenarios. We're not asking for any decisions here. I'll also note right now, based on some, concerns that have arisen over the past few weeks and also in this meeting, none of these scenarios solve all of the problems with regard to readiness. The final scenario for this tip is very unlikely to solve most of these problems. There's going to be a lot of outstanding issues in any scenario that is selected this year for a future tip to resolve. Each of these scenarios are options. There is no best option. Subjectively, one could say there is no good option either, as far as how this can be addressed. I would like to note that the discussions that are happening here today in this committee meeting will continue into next week's MPO board meeting, and then what happens at that board meeting will continue into our next TIP committee meeting on March 27th. That would then lead into the April 3rd meeting to select a final scenario. So we're just getting started here. Also note, just other meetings to consider that would then feed into the April 17th draft release. We do have a quarterly readiness update in May. That's usually to talk about readiness situations that are going to emerge after we select a scenario. We may consolidate the May 22nd TIP committee meeting to happen in the afternoon following that morning's MPO board meeting. Those logistics are still being looked at. And then June 5th MPO would be endorsement of the TIP. On the next slide, I just want to do some high-level thoughts here that I think we are about to hear during discussion. So there's still some things that need to be answered. One, there's still funding in all of these scenarios to varying degrees for fiscal 26 for any potential other projects or fill-ins there. MassDOT, MBTA, MWRTA, etc. The Cape Ann Transportation Authority, it's worth noting, all of their funding requests were funded as part of Amendment 10, which is why they are not on this list, but if they have other funding requests, those could also be considered. There's still the outstanding question, which I'm sure we're about to discuss, about funding in the outer years of the TIP and how that could be allocated and how that relates to the potential to leave any reserves. On the next slide, then we'll get into discussion, sorry, I'll just note some things. Over this past year of TIP development, there's been improvements to project processes and developments for gathering and sharing information on project changes and programmatic lists, especially versus previous TIP development years. But something that came up during the rescoring presentation is that in the effort to identify additional information for these projects, is that staff now know more about what we do not know, which is to say we now know where there are various knowledge gaps and areas of strain on projects. We've also, as a result of learning and gaining more information, now have new questions and new challenges to try and address. And as I said earlier, regardless of the scenario that gets picked here today, there's going to be persistent readiness and cost volatility across all 5 years of the TIP. Most of these scenarios are not going to remedy that risk, and some of these scenarios are going to make future TIPs likely have an even greater deal of risk incorporated into them, at least from the cost perspective. The idea here is just to lay the groundwork for future meetings, and with that, I will stop talking for a bit and field any questions.
Thank you, Ethan. That's a lot. And I'm gonna go to Jay, and then Len, you did have your hand up, and then John, unless you want to wait.
I would much prefer for John to go before me, because that will probably answer a lot of my questions or maybe engender some more, you know, but thank you.
I will also cede my time to John for now. Yeah.
John. All right.
I don't have a lot to add. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of work, Ethan. You know, we all recognize and commend you for and having to balance the entire program, not just Boston. I know how difficult it is. The point I wanted to make, I believe, the scenario that included some rebalancing of the 4 projects in scenario 1C, which includes Hingham. There was some discussion with Hingham. We're meeting with the town, but MassDOT doesn't is not confident that Hingham can be delivered in fiscal 26. And I just want to make sure that's reflected in your scenarios, so that way we don't focus on something that's not possible to happen. We have met with the town, and we have met with some of their elected officials, and we do have some follow-on meetings. The desire to deliver in fiscal 26 is not enough to actually complete the work that's necessary. So I just want to be fully out front on those items for that specific project. And let me just see. You said a lot of things, so I was writing. You know, I got a hand cramp going on a couple things. I had a couple items on the design pilot, but nothing that's significant. I got to look at a few of those a little more closely. And you know what we've done, and I think to answer Dennis's comment about especially Lynn, which was kind of part of several of the scenarios here with multiple projects. In the past, when we've had questions, we've asked the community to come to a future meeting and tell us what's going on and what your commitments are, and funding constraints, timing constraints, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that would be appropriate for the city to come in and talk about Essex Street and Western Ave, which they are funding the design of 2 sizable projects within the region. So not to single out anybody else that's not funding sizable projects in the region, but they seem to be in like at least 3 of the scenarios that I may have missed. 1, 2, and Lynn was factored in all 4 of the scenarios that you described, I believe, with some varying solutions. So I just wanted to bring those 2 items to point, and then be happy to answer any other questions I can.
Thanks, John. Next to Jay.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks, Ethan. Impressive juggling with all this, as always. I think you kind of partially answered my comment, but essentially here, as we move projects into different years, we're really doing so to balance the tip more so than we're doing it based on certainty that these projects will definitely be ready in those years, right? I mean, we're trying to make the paperwork, work for the federal folks that, and at DOT. But we recognize that, some of that may not be realistic as these projects advance. And so to that end, I guess I'm posing a question generally to the group. I mean, we obviously put a lot of trust in John Bouchard and his team to tell us, are these projects, are these proponents ready? Will they be ready? Can they do the work? How do we, if we're going to move a project, say that's not even at 25%, and we're saying move it from 26 to 28, as I think we're doing. I mean, how do we, or should we have some certainty that that's possible from a design and review perspective? Like, and again, going back to, I know we're just trying to make the whole picture look, work and balance the finances, but are we really able to say a project that's not at 25% today, has been on the tip for 6 years, will be ready a year or two later, right? Is that, and how do we address that? And I'm just curious to hear thoughts from maybe either John or from Ethan.
Let me answer that question and talk just briefly about the scenarios that Ethan has put together. Ethan put together these scenarios based on Readiness Day's recommendations by MassDOT. So my team, from right-of-way, environmental, the district offices, the design, and other review sections, review the ability to deliver the project within the fiscal year that it's currently programmed. We do not factor in cost. We factor in ability to deliver. And unfortunately, we have to make a decision within a very narrow window. And I say that by, we're assessing, say, and we do this, we try to do this every couple months and just take a snapshot, but the decisions that we make, and they bring me recommendations in January, February, and then as part of our readiness days, I take that information, the input of the community and MPO members that are part of it, and I make a recommendation that based on the information that we have at that time, so I say kind of today, the first week of February of the current fiscal year, it's difficult for, it's going to be risky to deliver this project within an individual year. And that's the basis of our recommendation. 2 months can go by and a permit can just all of a sudden sail through, and a project could be deliverable in the year it was originally programmed as part of that discussion, but we've already kind of moved beyond making that recommendation, which is kind of unfortunate, but we make that recommendation based on risk. And our assessment is based on not capturing the money, not obligating the money. And it's not the important, I don't want this to sound the wrong way, but it's not based on how important it is to the community. And we say, no, it should go next year or the year after. It's really about, can we deliver the project within the programmed year based on what we know at the time of that assessment? And I mean, we're doing this constantly on our project designs, et cetera, but at that time, we do a snapshot and we say, we have too many permits. The city, town has, too much right of way to accomplish in that time frame, or the design and the public outreach has caused a stall in the design development. Maybe we don't have 100% support, so we reinvestigating other alternatives. And that's kind of the design decision or the recommendation we make, is that, if I could make this recommendation the day before the money expired in September, and, I have 6 more months to make that assessment, then it could be a different answer. But we have to make an assessment in, at this time, February, January, February, March, And based on the information I have, I say, this is going to be really tough to deliver. So it would be better to make a recommendation to move it a year or more, depending on what the complexity is, and bring a project into that fiscal year that is deliverable and has less risk factors. Now, what I do commit when I do that with my team, and then when we meet with the individual cities and towns, is that if it's a local permit or it's local right of way, I'll say, look, if we can move this from fiscal 25 to 26, if it's ready in November of 25, which is part of fiscal 26, we'll advertise it. We're not, when I say we're moving it a year, we're moving it a year in programming, not necessarily a calendar year, 12 months. And Jay, you may remember this happened in Everett just a couple of years ago. We were concerned with the ability for the city to acquire, 100 plus right-of-way easements. And we were making a potential recommendation that, if the city can't, if there's concern with the ability, the number of easements, to get done in that time frame. But we were saying, look, if we move this, we're going to move it into fiscal whatever year it was, but we'll commit to doing it in the first quarter. So in October, November, December. So it was really a 1 month or 2 month delay versus a 12-month delay. So I wanted to at least address that particular piece. And, Ethan has assembled this, and I know it's kind of like we called it kind of a paper or a monetary exercise. But it's based on DOT's recommendations that a project should move to whatever fiscal year, because we've determined that right-of-way, permitting, design, et cetera, can't be completed within that window. And again, it's based on, a little bit of a, we kind of call it a snapshot in time that we feel that it couldn't be delivered. If I could go to the 11th hour of the 11th day, I would do it. And then say, okay, so here we are in September, we still can't deliver this. I don't have enough time to bring in another project into that pipeline that year, and then we could lose the money. And that's, so we make decisions, we try to focus, and as I said, if we can't deliver something in the current fiscal year, can we deliver it in the next fiscal year? Is it really a 3-month delay because of town meeting on a town project, because they have to go to town meeting? Is it a Coast Guard permit? What are the items that are delaying this? And then we'll work with the community on the add date such that we don't lose an entire year, because obviously August, September to November is a couple months, and it's not an appreciable delay in actual start of construction or anything like that. It's really just obligating the federal money.
Yeah. John, I really appreciate that. I know you guys work really hard and, to make all this fit together.
I mean, we have a lot of people put a lot of time into this, Jay.
Yeah,
I know all of you. And Ethan has tried to capture that with several scenarios here. So I appreciate the effort he's put in.
No, absolutely. And I think and I commented about this last week, when we get to this point, it seems like, is there something we could have caught earlier, or is there a point in time at which you could say we need to put more effort or more pressure on somebody or something to avoid it from, to avoid that delay?
Well, we meet every week and on our priority of projects meeting, and we don't discuss every single project, but every week we meet on like a range of projects, from like a fiscal from an advertising date of, let's say, March 15th to July 15th or something like that, and we assess that, and we do an individual review, and the PM comes back and says, here's where I'm stuck, or here's where the right of way or the permitting, or this is going to take longer. And we troubleshoot it at that point. And then if there's a follow on to that, then I usually reconvene an individual project meeting with, the key players to say, okay, how can we break this log jam? And then we do that. So the future year projects, we generally don't do a lot of distillation and of that stuff. We're generally managing our current year and maybe 1 year out. We're trying to stay ahead of it to identify where our trap doors are, and can we mitigate those trap doors? Can we get through this quicker, more efficiently? Can I change the project, you know, whatever the case may be.
I appreciate that, John. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that maybe what you hit on there last is something we've been running up against, is that I think there's typically more scrutiny as the projects get closer to their advertisement date and the current year tip, and then but getting a sense of where projects are,
Yeah.
how likely they are in the outer years has been more challenging. We did, I wanted to remind folks, ask all project proponents that where they hadn't hit a milestone within the past year to produce simplified schedules showing how they were going to hit the ad date. We did get some responses, not all, or actually not most. So I think that we're still lacking quite a bit of information there.
Yeah, lacking some answers. I understand. Yep.
Yeah. And I think one thing to note, amongst the scenarios is, I think we haven't heard anything from Lynn, so that's kind of some information that we would need. But among the scenarios I'm hearing, John, you said that you have some reservations around 1C. I'm curious. I know, Glenn, we need to get to you. I'm recognizing that we're running low on time too, but I'm curious if others have thoughts on specific scenarios. I know 1C seems risky to me, given that it's not addressing any of the, it's just kind of moving money around. But and 1B and 1D to me are, delaying projects where proponents did provide some information to us. But I'm curious what others feel about it. Len.
Thank you, and I'll be quick by talking fast. Well, first off, I appreciate that we have a handle on the readiness, but we don't have a handle on its cost, especially on those that haven't been that aren't more than 25% design, and that's where we're going to get caught. Now, given there's an increasing chance of recession, chances are we're going to see these projects go up in cost a whole lot. And that's where I think we need to be hardcore on folks. With respect to getting things up to design. The percentage of design that we need. We create we create a major moral hazard, by saying to folks, once you're on the tip, you're on the tip. I think we need to figure out some way to get people off the tip, into the universe, when they haven't hit their design milestones, in an adequate amount of time. I'm going to propose something radical. It's not going to go because I know previously when I said we should keep a reserve, that didn't fly, but I would just take anything that's not at 25% design, that certainly hasn't been designed, has been on the tip for a long time, hasn't been at 25% design, take them off the tip, put them in the universe, and say, when you give us information, we'll then pull you out of the universe, and put you back onto the tip, even if that means having big reserves, in the mid years and maybe even the outer years, and simply say, we're not going to lock you out, but you haven't given us the information that we need. And that could also fit into giving us the information that we need to do the rescoring, because the deal is, a lot of times these projects go up in cost because their scope increases. And it may very well be that they go up, even without a scope increase, they go up in cost so much that when we look at them compared to other projects, it's like, maybe not so much. And that's why I would say take them out of the tip if they haven't performed, put them in the universe and say, we're going to reevaluate you. If you want to reapply and give us more information, great. We may not have to call it reapplication. We just say, look, we need more information. This is the information we want. Give us information. We'll make a decision based on the new information that we have. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Appreciate that. Tom.
Thanks, Jen. A couple of things. One, I wanted to ask John on scenario C with McGrath. Is there any issues with the district of, basically just moving the money around to try to balance things? So I just wanted to see if there was any issues with the district as far as, the actual construction. Does this cause any problems in that?
Tom, I'm going to look at that more closely. I didn't think so. It didn't jump out at me. But we're going to look at that before the MPO meeting next week, so that way I have some of those answers.
All right, great. I know we played this game with the Green Line extension for years, so,
Yeah, no, understood.
Yeah. And then my second one is kind of addressing, we've heard it from Dennis and Len and a few others, the whole 25% issue. So back, I don't even know now how many years ago it was. It's at least a couple that, I was on a subcommittee that we looked at, all this. And our recommendation at the time was that, going forward, in order to be on the tip, you had to be at 25%, but we did grant this grace period for projects that were already kind of in the mix. I don't believe we ever said when the grace period ends. And I think that the MPO board needs to finally address this, because this is one of the biggest problems that I'm seeing with what Ethan's proposed today. But to have a project that is 6 to 8 years old, and we don't know what the current costs are. And actually, I'm surprised. I would think if certain projects that were really looking, to be on there, there'd be more advocacy for them, and I'm not seeing that either right now. Like, I think Jen, you said, well, we'll have to reach out to Lynn to see what they have to say on that. Lynn should be all over this, to make sure that if they really want these projects, to be advocating for them and explain to us, why, what's going on and things like that. So, this isn't really for today, but I think at the MPO meeting, very soon we need to finally address this and say, okay, grace period's over. If you want to be on the tip, you got to be at least 25%. And hopefully that would help a lot of things. But that's it for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, I'm seeing Len in the chat. A or D, pressed, picked 1A. Okay, thanks, Len. Jay, are you next?
John Rocco, I think he was before me.
Oh, okay. Is it John?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. So I can't say one of the few times I disagree with Len. I don't think we should just rip people out. I think that our practice has been for the probably 15 or 20 years I've been on the MPO, that kind of, like it or not, once you're on, you've been on, and we've never ripped anybody out. So I think that's something that it would be hard to just start doing that without establishing that and saying, whether it's next year's tip or starting in 3 years or in 2 years, we would have to establish that. And I think the whole MPO should vote on that, and people should know when that's going to be. However, I do think that the part I do agree with Len is we should, and I think Tom is part of our committee that we were on, and Len was on that too, and Jay, I believe. I think we should call these people on the carpet, and we should say, whether it's at the full MPO meeting or if it's at the TIPA committee, that they should come in and we should say, listen, we haven't heard from you in 3 years, 5 years, 8 years. What's the story? You're not doing anything. And then, and maybe say that, either we're gonna push you out to the, to 2030 or beyond, or we're gonna keep pushing you out. But I think we should call them on the carpet and tell them exactly what we're looking for. I think we send these, user-friendly emails that, just say, stop by and chat with us. I think we're beyond stop by and chat with us. I think we need to send them a detailed letter telling them exactly what we want from them and when we want it, and see where they're at, and either then we can think about, what the next steps are from there. But, they are not given, whether it's Eaton or John's team or whatever, exactly what we need. But, not picking on anybody, but if, according to Adriana, if they, got approved for PIC in 2018 and 7 years later, they're still not at 25% design, something's up. But maybe there's a real issue out there that we're all okay with. We just need to know what it is. Doesn't mean they're not doing nothing. You know, we assume they're not doing nothing, but that may not be the case. Thank you.
I'm seeing, think in order, Dennis, Jay, and Ethan, and I am wanting to note that we're over time, so perhaps we can wrap up with those comments.
I'll do that. I'll be really brief if I could. Thanks, Jen. I agree with Len. I agree with Tom. I think we need to take a hard stand. I make the analogy of the student that comes home to the parents and says, "Geez, the teacher gave me a C." No, the teacher didn't give you a C. You got a C. And I see the same thing for the cities. I mean, they have been around haven't done anything for 7 years. It's their responsibility to advance the project, and they didn't do it. And so I don't think that us deciding to take it off the tip is something that we're doing. They did it to themselves. So I think we should really consider making some hard choices this year and send a message that we're just not going to be able to accommodate that. You've got to get to 25%. And we made that announcement, as Tom said, a few years ago, and we backed off sometimes on it, but it still is out there. And I think we should be more hardball, given the constraints that we have and the problems that we're facing last year and this year. We used to solve it. I'm done. Thank you.
Jay.
I just had another quick question for John Bashar, but I think he jumped off. I don't know if anybody else from MassDOT might answer this question. But it's my understanding that MassDOT assigns a project manager to the project only after it's been put onto the tip. Is that correct? In other words, we have a lot of projects in the universe, but naturally, MassDOT doesn't have enough resources to assign a project manager to every project until there's some commitment that project is moving forward, right? So is it the case that their process doesn't start until we've put a project on the tip?
I think I can potentially answer that because I believe it varies depending on the project. I believe it depends on when the project is actually scoped. So not necessarily if it goes through project review committee, at which the project ID number is assigned, but I believe after a scoping meeting is conducted, which is a pre-25% activity, that may be when a manager is assigned. But it also still requires the proponent to advance the project towards that pre-25 stage.
Right.
I do not work on the engineering side of this, so I don't know if that's accurate, but I have sat in a couple of those meetings. So
I just bring that up because if we do remove folks from the tip, or we, on the one hand, I'm a fan of leaving a lot of, open funds in outer years, but if the result of that is we're not building the pipeline of reviewed projects by MassDOT, that could bite us. So it's sort of better understanding, and this isn't a knock against anybody, it's just sort of trying to better understand when does MassDOT's involvement start, and then how do they prioritize what's in front of them? Because I think that could, inform how we treat projects as well. Thanks.
Makes sense. So maybe we can follow up on that after the meeting in terms of, when the project management starts in the cycle. Aaron, did you have anything before we start? Nope. Okay. All right. So with that, it doesn't appear we're going to the MPO with any clear preference, but we did have some preferences aired by some members. So we'll have some time between now and the MPO meeting to think further on that. And sounds like Ethan will be sending out the deck, so you can spend some more time with it as well. I would like to move to members' items, unless anyone has any burning. All right. We are meeting again, this committee on March 27th. That will be a virtual meeting at 1 p.m. There's also the MPO meeting next week, which staff correct me, is 10 a.m. and is hybrid. Is that correct? In person and virtual. Do any other members have items to share before we adjourn? All right. Seeing none, could I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
Excellent. Do I have a second?
And
Right. Thank you, everyone.
You did a great job, Jeff. I can only imagine how much you wanted to talk, but you held back.
Try not to too much as chair.
Take care. Bye-bye.